Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Brad Hamilton, and in this video I'm going to show you how to create an explosion with the Khaos add-on for Blender 3D. In the last video I showed you how to install the Khaos add-on in Tab. If you don't have the Khaos add-on yet, then be sure to go to that last video and follow a few of those basic steps. Anyways, let's get started here. Go ahead and open up Blender and then make sure that our Cycles rendering engine is selected here. Then we're going to go through the steps inside of Khaos to create an explosion. First, we are going to choose the frame on the timeline when we want the explosion added to the scene. So let's say we want our explosion added at frame 20. We'll just click on the timeline for frame 20. And now we're going to select where we want our explosion added to our scene. Simply move your 3D cursor to where you want your explosion to start from. Now we're going to go to our Khaos tab here, which will be installed here on the bottom. And first we are going to choose our smoke type. We have three options for our smoke type. The first one, which is just smoke. The second one, which is smoke and fire, where the smoke is emitted from the fire. And the third, where we have the smoke and fire emitted in a much thicker way. All of these are presets inside of Blender that Khaos is using to streamline your particle explosion creation process. So let's go ahead and click on Dynamic Smoke Fire. And now we're going to choose the debris we want added to our explosion. So we'll select glass, maybe we'll add some wood, some burning debris, some sparks, and some tree branches. And now we'll go here to the bottom, and our default particle parameters might be interesting to start out with, but we're going to change a few of the parameters for this explosion. I have a detailed infographic on what these particle parameters do coming out soon, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to leave it mostly the same, except for changing the fuel start amount to 5. If you want a quick breakdown of what each of these particle parameters do, you can just hold your cursor over them, and a description of what each parameter does will be shown in the black space here. So as you can see, when we hold our cursor over Scale Random Spread, it tells us that this will scale the random spread of all of our particles. And if we hold our cursor over the fuel start amount, then it tells us in the black space here that the fuel start amount scales the amount of fuel emitted from fire particles at the beginning of the blast. For the sake of this tutorial, we're going to leave this the same, except for changing our fire particle start amount, as well as our particle start size, which we're going to change to 3. Because our particle start size is going to be much bigger than our particle end size, our explosion is going to start like a smoky blast, and then end with a more debris-like result. So now that we've set our appropriate particle parameters, we are going to select our type of Khaos. In Khaos, we have 3 different options to choose from. We have directional burst, omnidirectional burst, and 360 ground burst. And in this tutorial, we're going to do an omnidirectional burst. So go ahead and click there. And as you can see, where our cursor was, now we have our particle system added to our scene, as well as our custom domain cube around those particle systems. So let's go ahead and select our domain, and let's go to the physics panel here. And we'll actually go ahead and deselect our camera and our eyeball tool here, so that we can actually just look at the particles without our smoke domain trying to bake any of our smoke simulation yet. And if we go through the frames here, we can see that all of the particle systems are emitted from the center here. And actually, if we go to our smoke fire omnidirectional particle emitter, we can actually see the particle system that will be adding the smoke to our scene. One of the things we want to do is make sure that this specific particle system stays within our domain cube for the entirety of its existence. So as you can see, our domain cube is a little bit small as the particles are exiting it. So one thing we'll do is just click on it and press S to scale it up. Of course, you can customize your smoke domain cube as well, but right now we have it so that it's a balance between quality and time efficiency when creating your explosion. Now let's go ahead and reselect our options here by our smoke domain here. And now we're going to bake our explosion. I recommend always baking a lower resolution version of your explosion first, so that you can see the general size and shape of the explosion. So if you want to make any changes, you don't have to wait a long time to bake another version of that. You just want to dial in the basic shape of the explosion first, and then after you've decided that the basic shape and style of the smoke sim is what you want, you can rebake it with a much higher resolution for a more realistic result. So first we are going to do a low resolution bake. We will have the high resolution checkbox selected, So if you want to save even more time, you can deselect your smoke high resolution box here, but I usually leave the smoke high resolution on even for the original bake with a division of 1 just to give a little bit of detail in that original bake. Anyways, let's go to our smoke cache here. And before we bake our explosion, we need to actually save our file, as Blender won't allow us to bake the smoke simulation without doing this. Let's go ahead and name our file to Khaos tutorial for explosion. And then save as Blender file. And now as you can see, we're free to bake all of our smoke simulation. So let's go ahead and bake this from frame 1 to say frame 50. And we don't want to simulate the explosion for longer than we need it for. So since we just want to see what the initial blast looks like in this specific bake, we're just going to do it from 1 to 50. So let's go ahead and press Bake All Dynamics. And now this is a good time to just take a quick break and let your computer do some calculations and then come back to see if you want any more adjustments made before you create a high resolution version of your blast. So now that we've baked a lower resolution version of our explosion, let's go ahead and create an initial material for our explosion smoke. So make sure that your domain is selected here. And we're going to go ahead and set up the scene for a render so that we can see our materials a little bit better. So let's go ahead and press Shift A, and then we'll go to camera, and then we'll just kind of position this camera so that it can see the explosion pretty well. So let's press G and Z, and then pull it back, and kind of drag it so that we can view our explosion in a nice frame here. Now we're going to add a world around our explosion. So go ahead and click on the world panel here, and then click on Use Nodes, and then click on the dot next to your color here, and add a sky texture. And that's going to add a sky to our scene so that we can see our smoke a bit better. And then we're just going to add a few lights to our scene as well, just to illuminate our simulation. So go ahead and press Shift A, and go to Lamp, and then Hemi. And now we'll just position a few lamps here to light up our smoke. So we'll put one off to the side to the right of our camera, and just rotate it over so it's hitting our smoke here. And then while this light is selected, press Shift D to duplicate it, and then we'll put this one off to the left and also direct it toward the smoke. Maybe scale it up so it's a little bit bigger source, and bring it back. And we'll make the strength of this light a little bit less so it's not quite as strong as our first light. And then we'll duplicate one more here to create a backlight for our smoke. So we'll bring this one behind the smoke simulation according to the camera, and just rotate it around so that we'll have a backlight on the opposite side of where our camera is located. And we'll go ahead and scale it up here, and then also make this one a little bit stronger than the other two lights in our scene. And this should light up our smoke enough so that we can play with our materials inside of our domain cube. So let's go ahead and select our domain cube, and then open up a new window here by going over to the crossbars here and just dragging over. And we'll go to this second window and go to our node view, and we'll make sure that our material node is selected here. And this is where we can change our smoke material to get a variety of different results. So let's go to our camera mode in the left version of our window, and then we'll just go to rendered view here. And as you can see, we already have an interesting looking smoke material here. But one thing we need to do before we play with the materials is actually change a few of the render settings. So let's go to our camera mode here, and then let's just go to geometry. And then we'll decrease our step size to 0.01, and then decrease our max steps to 260. And I've found that decreasing our step size and decreasing our maximum steps allows for a little bit better result. Generally, when your step size is smaller and your max steps are bigger, you'll get a better result, but I found that these settings give you pretty good results. And now we'll go to light paths, and then we'll make sure that volume is at least at 4. What volume is going to do is it's going to allow the light to scatter around our smoke simulation. So if it's a very thick smoke, you won't need as many volume bounces, as the light won't really need to bounce around as much. But if you're going for a very dusty explosion that has a variety of thick dust and a wispy dust, then you're going to want to increase the volume bounces a bit more. So I found that if you leave it at 4, it's pretty nice to dial in the materials, and then when you go for your render, I'm recommending increasing it to between 5 and 8, 8 yielding the best result. So let's go ahead and make sure our smoke domain is selected here. And what we can do in our smoke domain material here is change a variety of settings to change the way the smoke and fire looks. And there are really unlimited ways you can make this smoke explosion look. So the first thing we can choose is the color of our smoke. We're actually going to leave this at default, but you can change it to any color within the RGB spectrum. The next value you can change is the density of the smoke. Right now we have the density pretty high at 600, but this is one of those values you can play depending on the simulation you are going for. I've done values as high as 2000 for very thick smoke, and then I've done values as low as 20 where the smoke is just kind of a dusty simulation. But I'm going to go ahead and bring this down to say 400 just to give a little bit less density to our smoke. And then we'll go to our flame settings here. In our flame attributes, you can change a variety of things. This first color ramp changes the color of the fire depending on where it is in our simulation. So you can just play with these points along your color ramp to give the fire different colors at different points. Right now this is looking pretty good, but if we want a little bit more red in our spectrum, we can just bring these values over a little bit and bring a little bit more red inside of our simulation. This is one of those things you can just play with to customize it to your liking, to give it a little more realistic look. The second color ramp here is essentially controlling how much our smoke is surrounding our flame simulation. So essentially, the more we bring over to the right our black bar here, the more our smoke kind of surrounds our fire here. As you can see, when we bring this black bar over to the middle here, it kind of hides our flames within the smoke a little bit more. And we're just barely getting any fire for this specific frame of the simulation. I usually leave this black bar near the far left of this color ramp, and this should look pretty nicely for us. And finally, we can change our multiply value for our flame simulation here. I usually leave the multiply value for our flame setting and our multiply value for our density setting somewhere close. So since we have our density at 400, I'll also put the multiply value for the flame at 400. And you can also play with the brightness and contrast of both the density and the flame effect. I'm going to leave them all at 0 for this specific example. It's looking pretty good here actually, and we're getting pretty good detail in the middle for our low resolution version of this blast. And we have our burning debris particles coming out nicely near the end of our explosion, giving us a little bit more unique look. We've added these particles through our checkbox here, and then we have a variety of debris around our explosion. Our smoke is exiting our domain cube a little bit, so when we rebake our higher resolution version of this explosion, we need to make sure that our domain cube is a little bit bigger so that it captures the entirety of our blast. So let's go ahead and close our material window here. And before we bake our high resolution version of this explosion, we're going to go ahead and view our explosion in real time with our OpenGL render active viewport option here. So let's go ahead and change our timeline here from 1 to 40. And we'll go ahead and click on the slate here near the bottom of our screen. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to see in a preview mode the speed of our explosion. So this is one of the best ways to see how your explosion is going to look without rendering every single frame of it. So it's just going through the frames 1 through 40, and then we can just go to render, play rendered animation, and then now we can see how our explosion is going to look in real time. And you can kind of judge to see how your particles are looking and see if you want to make any adjustments from here. And this is looking pretty good. So now we're going to bake our high resolution version of this explosion. So go ahead and close this and then go to 3D view. And then now we're going to prep our smoke domain for a high resolution bake. So let's just go ahead to our physics panel while our smoke domain is selected, and then click on free all bakes. And then we'll go ahead and scale up our smoke domain a bit, press S and just drag. And then there are several ways we can increase the resolution of our smoke simulation. One of the first ways is through our resolution divisions here. Right now it's at 128, but if we increase this to say 200 or 256, then our simulation is going to be much more detailed and realistic. At the same time, if we increase this, it will also change a little bit of how the smoke moves within our domain cube. So if you don't want to change any aspects of how your smoke moves within your domain cube, but you want to add more detail to your smoke simulation, then you just want to go to the smoke high resolution panel here and then increase your resolution divisions. The more divisions you add, the more detail that will be added to your original simulation. Of course, also the more divisions you have, the more bake time the simulation is going to require. I found that if you leave your resolution divisions at 128 and you increase your resolution divisions to 3 or 4, then you'll get a fairly realistic explosion unless you're using that render up very close to the camera. The third way you can increase the resolution of your smoke is by going into the smoke adaptive domain here, and here we can actually change the additional number of cells within our domain cube. For our high resolution explosion, we're going to change a variety of settings here, but just keep in mind that depending on what you change, you'll get a variety of different results. For this specific example, we're going to change our resolution to 200, and then we're going to change our smoke high resolution to 2. Then we're going to go to our adaptive domain here and increase the additional number of cells to say 30. And since it's scaled up our domain cube, we'll just scale it back down a little bit. And then we'll go to our smoke cache, and then we'll actually bake our final high resolution explosion from frame 1 to say frame 60. And now go ahead and save your project and press Bake All Dynamics. This final high resolution baking process can take a bit of time depending on the power of your computer, so this may be a good time to take a break and come back a little bit later. Alright, so now that Blender has finished baking our explosion, it's looking pretty good here. Our last few steps is simply double checking our domain material and then preparing Blender to export our sequence with an alpha channel. We'll go ahead and go to our camera view here. And as you can see, I've actually changed my camera settings here to a square resolution. I'm going to be rendering this explosion with a resolution of 1280 by 1280 pixels. This is just for the sake of an example. So again, if you want a more high resolution version, then I recommend you increase the resolution to something like 1920 by 1920. The point of the square resolution is simply so we can see all of the debris come out in every direction equally, so that we can use those elements in the composite as well. Let's go ahead and check our smoke domain material really quick. Go ahead and select an area on our timeline here where our explosion is starting. Then we'll open up a new panel here where we can change our smoke settings. Then we'll go to our node editor here and go to node. And I've actually gone through and found some values that work specifically for this explosion here. I put the density of our smoke at 200, then I've put our color ramp gradient like this, and our second color ramp is just our black bar a little bit to the right of its endpoint. Then our flame multiply node is also at 200. Okay, so let's go ahead and close our domain window here and press Z to get out of our rendered mode. And we're going to use the same lighting setup as we used before, but let's go ahead and go to our camera settings really quick. And inside of our camera settings here, on the right side, you're going to set your appropriate resolution. And then we're just going to go to output here, where we can choose where we want our sequence to be output so that we can use it inside of a compositor. So let's just go ahead and click here and choose where our output is going to be. So we'll just add a new folder here and we'll call this Khaos Explosion Render. And then we'll just call this Khaos Explosion for Tutorial. And then just press accept. and then we want to render this sequence as an OpenEXR format. That's going to allow you to have some pretty good dynamic range and latitude within your images. Then we'll go down here to sampling, and sampling can actually be pretty low if you're just rendering smoke. I rarely go over 60 unless I'm doing something very specific, but anywhere between 40 and 60 is what I recommend. And then make sure our stopwatch here is selected, and then I usually put my clamp values at 3 for both the direct and indirect. And then let's continue down here to geometry, which we covered before, so we'll just leave that the same at 0.01 and 260 steps. On our light paths panel here, we'll change our volume bounces to 8. And then under the film tab, let's make sure that transparent is selected so that our alpha channel shows up when we're inside of our compositor of choice. And yeah, that is pretty much it, guys. Simply choose here at the bottom when we want our animation rendered. So since our explosion here starts at frame 20, I've told Blender to render from frame 20 to frame 60. So after you set up these render settings, just simply go to render animation and Blender will render your explosion. Anyways guys, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. I will be having more tutorials on rendering different versions of explosions inside of Blender, but this is the first introductory video for the Khaos add-on. I'll see you guys next time.